Ready? Okay. So today we are going to start our foray into JavaScript. And before we get into, bless you, before we get into utilizing React as a framework, we need to have an understanding of kind of like the underpinnings of how it's working, which means we need to make sure that we are utilizing the new in terms of JavaScript, which is ES6. So John just went over kind of like a history of like where JavaScript has come from. The past few years, the TC39 folks who've been kind of like holding on to JavaScript has decided to really decide that they are going to make improvements at a timed basis. So they started with the launch of ES5 and ES6. And talk a little bit about that right now. So as we mentioned, JavaScript is a living language. So this is going to be a scripting language that's going to continuously improve. And where we are right now is with ECMAScript 6 or ES6. It's also known as ES 2015, which is like the improvements that were made over the span of 2015. So there is ES7 and there is ES8, right? Because we're in 2016. I mean, we're in 2017. So 2016 did have some improvements. But in terms of the adoption of where JavaScript is, given that it's having to depend on so many different like browser adoptions or JavaScript engines that are running so many different browsers, it's hard to be able to say that like, okay, now we're not using any more old JavaScript. We have to make sure that we're basically accommodating everyone. So though you might not see all of these features utilized in every place that you're utilizing JavaScript, it's best to utilize the best practices of how the language is moving forward. And we're going to talk about a few of the ways that you utilize JavaScript now, and then I'm going to do like a quick intro to the kind of things that you, like a tool belts that you have to make sure that you are continuously learning the things that need to know in terms of JavaScript's development. Okay, so some things that are to me, most exciting about ES6 are the adoption of new ways to define variables. String interpolation has changed a little bit, and arrow functions. I'm also going to talk about a few other features, but these are like the most jarringly different things that you'll see when somebody is utilizing ES6 as opposed to the past JavaScript syntax. Okay, so const and let. In terms of the way that we had previously defined things in JavaScript, we were setting variables using the var keyword, okay? And the var keyword allows us to scope things. So a lot of this has to do with scope. It's not just the fact that you want to define things. It's that what you have available to you when you define something with var means that you are going to have something that's scoped to the function that you're writing it in. So this first line, var months, it's written outside of any function. So right now it's actually a global variable, which, as we remembered from when we were learning with Ruby and thinking about scopes, global scoped variables are horrible, right? You don't want to have them. So the variable, in addition to that, right, var birthday here, even though it's a defined, it's a named function that we set up, it's also a global variable, okay? Var here, var date, it is a variable that's scoped to this birthday function. Additionally, if I were to have created, so I'll just do that real quick actually. So if I were to, Okay, so if I were also to have did this like var birthday equals function, okay? And then inside of my variable body, I did like a for loop, like this, okay? And then also in here, if I asked if I did a console log for what I was in this, what do you think I would get? You would think that that was the case, right? But this var is scoped within the body of this for loop, right? So it's actually in the scope of this function out here. So it's actually bleeding out into the larger function here, which we don't want, right? Like it's not something that should be scoped outside of what it's actually doing, which is really just referring to this particular for loop, right? But we're exposing variables outside of what the purpose of that variable is. So in comes let and const. So in this case, const we're setting as, in this case, we're setting const months as a variable that is going to be not immutable, meaning that you can't redefine the content, but it's going to allow you to say that there's this variable has already been defined, so it shouldn't be redefined, or that term being reutilized in other ways that it shouldn't be. So it gives us a lot more information as developers to confirm that we're not, inadvertently messing up our code in ways that our code is not going to kind of notify us when we're utilizing variable as our keyword for defining things. Additionally, let is, both of these are scoped to the block of code that you're working on, not the function. So in the previous case where we had var I, instead of using var I and I use let, I equals this, okay? So let is going to be scoped within this block of code, within this for. So the block would start at this point. So we don't have that bleeding out, okay? And then it would, in this case, allow console log I to be undefined, okay? So that's what we have now, and this is probably something you should be utilizing as opposed to var. There really aren't a lot of reasons, very few reasons to use var now. You should be utilizing const and let. Const is just a more static variable, and let is something you would utilize more, like more frequent in terms of like just setting something within a scope of a block. Okay. String interpolation. So before, we have all these different ways to utilize strings in JavaScript. The most annoying thing is that, for example, we have this like long quote where we had to utilize like plus notation to set things together, which didn't make a lot of sense when you're dealing with different kinds of content that's not like purely mathematical. So now we have the like a backtick, which is like string, utilizing string interpolation. In this case here with quote with author, so we're utilizing $author here inside of the string, as opposed to having to add those things together and think about spacing and that kind of stuff. Instead, we can just set that all up in one string. Additionally, these backticks allow for multi-string interpolation. So if you press enter on after how, it's going to allow you to continue your sentence as opposed to having to string them together. Okay, there are also some additional things with all of these features that I'm not like getting into in detail, but this can allow you to do templatized type things, build templatized type functions, not just in the way that you think about in terms of string interpolation, but there's a really particular way to build functions around utilizing string literals with these backticks. Arrow functions is another very big feature that is set up with ES6 now that had not been previously dealt with. Before, when we defined a function, we just had like bar double, we were setting the function with one argument, and then there's a block saying like return this thing. Okay, where now we are allowed to take out basically the word function itself, and the arrow in itself is saying that it is a function. So this can be strung down to one line of code where you're saying the num, this is a arrow function, and then you have implicit returns now, which is not something that previously existed or was utilized in JavaScript, where if this is like one expression that's being made, you can just return that expression as opposed to having to explicitly return that function inside of this block. The other thing that I'm mentioning here is that an arrow function changes the way that we deal with this. This keyword I talked about a little before. Do y'all remember a little bit? This being like the way that you refer to something very similar in Ruby to self, right? But it's like the context, the contextual object or thing that you're working on inside of a function that was invoked when you called the function, or the thing that invoked the object, or the thing that invoked the function to be called. Okay, so inside of the function that you're using, you're asking for that invoked object to do certain things, like ask for this dot property, for example, right? So the arrow function will capture this at the definition of the definition of the function that you're using as opposed to the invocation of it. A lot of times when we were dealing with this, and that's like a larger nested this, you would lose the scope of what this was. And so then people would build variables called that or self, just to otherwise refer to the object that you're trying to work on inside of this context. But you don't have to do that with an arrow function. So it shifts the way you're utilizing this keyword when you're using an arrow function. And that has a lot of benefits. There are some moments where you don't want to use an arrow function when it comes to this. But for like 90% of the time, an arrow function is going to give you a lot more feasibility when it comes to utilizing this keyword inside of a function. Does that make sense to everybody following so far?
While and this could be by anything like string.
Let or const?
Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, let and const are the keywords you would utilize to define anything that you're doing. Mm-hmm.
With a number like the 400, number 400.
Yeah. Yeah. So instead of, like I mentioned before, here, so if so then if I was doing this here, like a for loop, I would say let I, not var I. Okay. Okay, we talked about arrow functions. Okay, so array methods. There are a lot of new ways that arrays are being utilized, two of which are the ways you can make an array. So these array.from and array.of are new methods in JavaScript that let you take advantage of the fact that there are some generated sets of things that are not going to be array specific that you can't do for example, you can't do dot map on things that aren't arrays in JavaScript. So if you were working with a node list, for example, you can say array.from like a set of node list objects, and that would allow you to do dot map on that set of things. So you can build an array of object type things or array-like things, and build an array from that, or a collection or a range, that kind of thing. Additionally, you can utilize array.of. So you can say, give me an array or build me an array of these type items. This particular set here, the syntax of these three dots, is actually another new feature of ES6 called the spread. So I can go into what a spread is in a little bit, but it's basically a way to extend out a set of things without explicitly defining that set of things. Yeah. Some other particular methods that you can utilize with a given array. So array.prototype means that these are methods that you can use on an array, whereas these array.from and array.of, those are like static methods on the array object that help you with like the creation of an array. Does that make sense? So those two methods did not exist before. Alternatively, these are methods that you can use on an array that did not exist before. Entries will give you the entries of the array. Keys and values, I'm sure makes some sense in terms of like what you can get from the array. Prototype.find and then find index. Those are.
After making an array from your object, then
you can run these methods on that given array.
So you have to, after making it from an object, after making it from a hash.
Not necessarily. So like if for any given array, you can utilize these methods. So it's not necessarily about like how, like at what point you defined the array. It's that these are methods that you can use on an array. Whereas these are not methods you use on an array. These are methods that you use to create an array from other things or of other things. That's why I distinguish the two. You can't do like, you know, array of things dot from array. It's not.
When you use it, you use array dot prototype.
So array.prototype is just meaning that these are methods that you can do on. Prototype is basically like synonymous with like object in a way. So on a thing that is a prototype of an array. So array.prototype means that like for a thing that is built as an array object, that's what array.prototype means. Right, so when you utilize it, you're not going to use array.prototype. So if I had like my array equals, you know, and you would do like 1, 2, 3, like that, right? So this is like the literal, this is like an object literal, okay? And then there's like prototype objects where I could also say like let my array equals new array. Okay, so I don't even know what array itself takes, but this would be creating, like, these are the two ways you can create an array, right? This one is defining a new array prototype object, okay? And then from there, like when you wanted to actually use, in either of these cases, if you wanted to utilize one of these methods, you can say myArray.find. Just like any other method or function that you're using. Array.prototype just means that this is a method that's built on the array prototype. Like arrays as a whole, any array can use these different methods for any array, whether you defined it or not. Okay. Okay. So I think the last thing that I'm going to go over for ES6 is classes. So I just mentioned that the way you would build an object, you can either create an object literal, which means that I am creating one version of a thing and that's it, right? Which is kind of like this. Like this array is it and that's it. There's no other version of this. Or if I wanted to create something like an object constructor, meaning that like it's almost like a factory. So I'm building like what a puppy would be, right? Where when I define a puppy, I say like this is its name, this is like this dot name is going to be name, and this dot breed is going to be breed. Like whatever arguments I bring in. Looks very similar to when you created classes in Ruby, right? But then when I want to create a new object utilizing this function, a new puppy object, this is how I would set it up. So then if, for example, I used this content and I wanted to create Sadie and I wanted to create like 10 other kinds of puppies, I didn't have to like explicitly write out each of those puppies with all their own separate functions and their own separate ways of being. I can just create one constructor object saying like, these are the properties of any new puppy that I want to create, and then these are the behaviors. So I would create puppy.prototype.bark, for example, right? So then if I did that, if I held all this information, function, puppy, where it had like name, breed, and then this name, name. Oops. Okay. So then I could additionally set puppy.prototype bark. And then, so old school would be like plus what's that name? So it's bark. Okay. So then if I created a okay, so if I created a new puppy, and then I wanted to say like Sadie.bark, I could do that. Even if so I would be able to do stuff like this. This would be basically like the way that I would create an object prototype. And then this is a prototype method. So any puppy, like any instance of this puppy prototype would be able to utilize this bark function.
So you don't even have to do console log because his puppy that prototype got bark.
Yes. So this is the invocation of this method. Yeah. Yeah, so if I wanted to do this dot bark equals function, so let's say I would say something that's, yeah, I can also define it inside of here. This dot bark is function.
I mean, you have to do that, but you just do the iteration.
What do you mean?
You do that outside another concept here, like something.
Oh, function, just function bark like that? Yeah, but it's an unnamed, undeclared function. So the idea for this is that if I want to have an object constructor and I'm building like a whole system of like, this is what a puppy does when I create a puppy, right? It has these variables, I mean, it has these attributes or properties, and it can also do this thing. I can either define that inside this, this function directly here, or I can do it outside of this function.
You need to put name inside
Here? Actually, I don't need to have any arguments. The idea that I'm doing this on any given puppy, a puppy should have a name property. So I would be taking the name from the puppy that this was invoked by. That's why I put this .name in there. Okay, so the idea is that if, like, let's say a year after I build this, somebody creates puppy.prototype.poop or something, right? Even though I created Sadie all the way back here in this original file, Sadie now has the ability to do that, has ability to like use that function, even though it was not originally created in this. So you can see how like that might become a problem. So classes are utilizing, like, these are better ways to kind of organize the syntax of what it means to build a constructor prototype object as opposed to just building it out in this way that's not as clear. So they built, they like reformatted the syntax. So this is what's called syntactical sugar. So on the underpinnings of this work, it's doing a lot of the similar thing. It's doing a similar thing in that it's creating an object, and you're creating like object.prototype methods. But the way that it's structured is different, and it's also allowing for like better scoping of the work that you're doing. Okay, so now instead of saying like function puppy and this kind of functionality, you can define classes by saying class puppy, and then you can utilize this kind of like almost like an initialized method called the constructor method that sets the properties for that like class object. Okay. There's a lot more detail in terms of the way they want classes to work, in terms of having both static methods. So when we went back and talking about like looking at this, like the array object, like the array object has static methods like .from and .of. This would be called the static method. And then prototype methods are more like methods that can be used on an instance of that object. So you're going to see in ES7 and the corresponding additions to JavaScript, discussions around static methods and the way that you can build prototype methods and like static properties, like the way that you would like add or build properties on a given object. But that's how that is set up now. I think that's the end of my slides. The only thing that I would say that I didn't go over that you will see is the addition of utilizing modules in ES6. And let's see, do I have that already? Do I have that open? ES6. A really good resource for kind of, if you want to like read a book on how ES6 is developing, is this exploringjs.com, specifically around ES6. It gives a good understanding of like things that are being set up. But you'll see modules being utilized, and they're very similar to how we've seen modules in Ruby. They're ways to extend and like componentialize. That's a word that I just created. Right, it's a way to kind of modularize sets of code so that they can be utilized in various spaces. But you'll see that being utilized using export and import in your code. You're going to see that a lot in React. It does get utilized. There are different modules that you can use in React, and that's kind of the way that they're standardizing the way that you would set up modules to use in your code in JavaScript. Any questions so far in terms of ES6? It's one of my favorite things. So if you have any questions, let me know. Additionally, if you go to, so some of the things, the tools that you're going to be using. So that's what I'm going to go into now. So one of the major tools that you'll probably see yourself utilizing is Babel. Babel is a JavaScript compiler. So some terms that you're going to see, and you're going to have to, you'll actually see it today in some of your challenges that you're going to work on, which I would recommend if y'all like pair today, unless you feel like learning on your own is like essential to you understanding this. It's a lot about just like getting in and understanding some of these tools. So you're going to get into like utilizing NPM. You're going to start understanding what Webpack is. And this is going to help you get an understanding of how the transition of using the latest version of code gets pushed down to all the other versions of JavaScript. So compilers are ways to basically take the code that you've written and like translate that out to multiple like spaces given whatever they need to know. So JavaScript, given that JavaScript has a lot of changes and there's a lot of people using different kinds of it, Babel is basically the compiler that breaks that down into like, oh, this is how you wrote it back in the day, or how this browser will understand it. So this would be the, like, this example is like the latest version of using JavaScript, hence the let here. Oh, I want to erase that. Yeah, so that is a use of an arrow function, and that's what it looked like before, right? So when we use map, oh, this is cute. So that's an example of a spread variable. So this is basically it's compiling down how ES6 works to the past versions of the language. And Babel is utilized by React to do that work. So a lot of the work that you would be doing, it was going to get compiled down to like older versions of JavaScript based on whatever version of browser needs to be rendering that JavaScript. What's the other tool that I wanted to talk about? We're already familiar with NPM, given that we've worked a little bit with Node. NPM is the package manager that's going to help you get whatever modules or libraries that you are going to be utilizing. So package.json is going to be stuff that you're going to get familiar with today. Understanding like what that looks like, and also like how Webpack works in terms of when you package the code that you're doing, the code that you're working with, how that kind of like gets packaged up to be utilized by other folks. How Webpack is going to help us with that. And let's see if there's any other things that you need to know. There are some other concepts that I didn't get into that you'll probably see more and more of. Some concepts that you'll get a lot more familiar with as we work with ES6 and React are hoisting, which is the idea of things being defined and kind of like moved up to the top of your code being read and interpreted. That's changed a bit in terms of ES6. And scope is also something you're going to have to think about a lot more, especially in terms of the way that things get bound. So like when this gets binded to the scope of a block as opposed to the scope of the function that it's being utilized in. Any other things that you need to know I can think of? Can't think of any other pieces that you need to know about. Yeah. Oh, actually, no, there is one more thing. So ES6 doesn't recommend the use of for loops. It's not the safest, best way to utilize to iterate over things. There are a lot of functions that you can use, like filter, find, map. There's additionally for each, but the best way to try and get into iterating over things is using for of. Yeah, for of lets you take for each thing of this array. There's a really good video that explains specifically why you don't want to use a for loop. It actually exposes your code to a lot more items than you would assume with just your array. And using a for of kind of like removes you from that like ending up with that mistake of having more items in your for loop than what you would expect to have. Yeah, I think those are all the major features that you need to know about. I guess a good first step is to get used to using let and const, and then from there trying to see like how you would translate some of your function use from using open functions to arrow functions. And
Do you find some website that use courses like this?
what website to use ES6?
I know, but I mean, it's a lot of I know, I want to see like an example on the way out.
So ES6 is let's see, how would I explain? I can't really give you like a list of all the places that would use ES6, but like if you want to see like more samples of like going from like the old. Well, so for this example with for each is for ES6 in general?
Not in the back end, you can see
so if you wanted to utilize, if you wanted to like be able to like play with your JavaScript and be able to like see what it does, I think the best example of doing that would be like doing stuff in the console, or doing that kind of work in Node. Node and IRB both give you a REPL to do that work. Additionally, if you wanted to play with like what, if I was writing this in ES6, what would it look like before that? It's kind of like, Babel has a REPL as well. So not just for like, you don't have to just look at like this transpiler or this compiler here, which showing that stuff here. You can also experiment how the code that you write is going to be transpiled back. So you can do that here. This is like an example of the arrow function again. So if you set that. Yeah. So whatever you write on this side, it's going to compile it back on this side. Is it what?
Yeah.
Is React a part of? Yes. React is basically built with like latest versions of JavaScript, and it's utilizing a lot of these features. So you'll see when we're learning React, how classes are being used, how modules are being used. You'll see that like using let and const is important. You'll see arrow functions. So yeah. So understanding these things is going to help you understand what React is doing, and that React is a framework for using JavaScript in a way that's like modularized and dealing with like the concept of components. We'll get into like all these words, but like I want to make sure that y'all realize how much of React is like, how much of it that you're doing is just JavaScript and how much of it is like React specific. Because whenever you're learning any new framework, right, you need to understand like, is this a Ruby thing or is this a Rails thing, right? Or is this an active record thing, which is Rails, or is this like just Ruby lets you do this? Alternatively, with JavaScript, you want to know like, this is a JavaScript thing versus this is a React specific library thing. Make sense? Okay, so the challenges that you have today are kind of going to give you an idea of like how NPM works. You're going to get into ES6. It's a challenge to kind of like work with Babel. ES6 Dragon is another way to like, I think you're going to be building like Dragon objects and how to do that. Yeah, and then learning about Mocha, which is a test suite for JavaScript. Cool. All right.